Hello everyone and welcome back to Let's Play Final Fight CD. In the last part we started off the game, we got through the first 3 stages, and now we're in the industrial area. Now I briefly touched on this last time, but there's also a non-zero chance some of you watching this don't recognize this stage. That's probably because you grew up playing the Super Nintendo releases. I'm assuming for cartridge space reasons more than anything else, the industrial area was removed in both Final Fight and Final Fight Guy for the Super Nintendo. Meanwhile, this is also from the arcade release. It's also in basically every other release. It's in the Game Boy Advance version and all that. Hell, something I actually haven't mentioned yet is that the Game Boy Advance version has a neat little extra bonus in that some of the Street Fighter variants of some of the characters are also present as secret playable characters, and that's real cool. Again, I would have played the Game Boy Advance version, but this soundtrack is the main reason I didn't. I love the instrumentation. So the industrial area was honestly a good choice of a stage to cut, all things considered, because I think this is the worst stage in the game when it comes to getting through without taking absurd damage. As you can see, there's a lot of fire hazards quite literally just bursting out, and you can use them to your advantage by baiting enemies into them. But they come out at uneven enough intervals and are spaced in weird places enough on top of some odd hitboxes that it's very easy to get hit by them. For right now, though, we're going to talk about the game's development staff. In specific, we're going to talk about the arcade version staff and then follow it up with the Sega CD version staff in specific so we cover both bases. Starting off, we got the planners, which I'm assuming are more directly kind of the director seats. We got 2 people in that overall for the arcade release, Akira Nishitani and Akira Yasuda. Nishitani, their first project was Forgotten Worlds in the arcade as a game designer. This in specific was their 4th project. They then worked on a lot of the console ports of this. They worked on the arcade version of Street Fighter 2 as a planner. They kept on through that until about 95, 96, when he left Capcom and founded his own company, Eureka, which I have briefly covered them before. They made the Street Fighter EX games alongside the game I brought them up in when I actually was LP'd that, Mega Man Network Transmission. Though Nishitani himself didn't work on Network Transmission as far as I can tell. Post the Game Boy Advance version of this, largely he hasn't been an executive producer if he wasn't a game designer, doing such for like Endless Ocean as recently as the most recent game from earlier this year. Special thanks in Tekken 8, executive producer for Chocobo GP and Pac-Man 99, that kind of stuff. Meanwhile, Akira Yasuda, on Moby Games at least, their first project was 1942 on the NES as the cover artist. This in specific was their 8th project where they were a planner. They continued to be a planner moving forward as well, doing the same thing on Street Fighter 2 in the arcades as well as most of the console releases. They were in the special thanks for Alien vs. Predator in the arcade, Street Fighter 2 Turbo, X-Men vs. Street Fighter. They were a character designer, otherwise known as Akiman. So if you've ever seen that in a Capcom fighting game from the mid to late 90s on, it's them. And they continued to do that through Street Fighter 3 into the early 2000s when they were largely in things like MS Saga, New Dawn as main character designer, the more recent Star Ocean games, their character design and all that. If you've seen the Star Ocean art from more recent years, you know the artist. Before I move on to the next group, which is the programmers, I should note basically everyone in this credits is using a pseudonym due to, I believe, Capcom and other game company policies at the time to prevent poaching. For instance, Akira Nishitani is Ponji or Nin. Akira Yasuda is Akiman. Meanwhile, the next programmers, 2 of them we actually know the identities of and their nicknames, but we actually don't know who 2 of the others are. There were 4 programmers, Kiyomi Kaneko as Kanekan, and Shinichi Ueyama as Shin, and Tomoyan and Yokoyan. Let's talk about the latter 2 first. Tomoyan only seemingly worked on this, as far as I can tell, on both Moby Games and Gaming and ArcadeHistory.com. Meanwhile, Yokoyan is credited in this, as well as the Willow arcade game. As for the 2 we know the identities of, Kiyomi Kaneko, this is their 2nd project after being a soft programmer on the first Strider. And they continue to be a programmer largely moving forward, being software design on Street Fighter 2 Turbo and Champion Edition, for instance. They're also an uncredited programmer for Mega Man Wily's Revenge on Game Boy. They programmed a lot of stuff for Breath of Fire, Final Fight 2, they were in the N64 staff for Mega Man Legends. But their most recent credit as a programmer was on the Final Fight Double Impact game on the 360. Otherwise, the most recent credit was on the re-release of Resident Evil 0 in Special Thanks. Shinichi Ueyama, on the other hand, this was their 2nd project, their first one being Ghouls and Ghosts in the arcade, and they've continued to be a programmer since. They were more directly involved in overall programming for like the Street Fighter 2 releases and all that, But come like the Dreamcast era, they worked on a lot of network programming for things like Street Fighter 3, Capcom vs. SNK, even some Gundam games that Capcom did at the time. They continue to still do non-fighting game programming though, as they were the programmer for the Resident Evil Outbreak games. They did tech support for the Genji, Days of Blade and Dawn of the Samurai games in the PS2 and 3. Their most recent credits are on Final Fight Double Impact for the 360, as well as the PS3 version of Marvel vs. Capcom 2 as a network programmer. For now, though, it's time for a very familiar boss to me. This is Rolento. Rolento is arguably the fastest boss in the game, as he has after images, and when he's doing that, you basically can't hit him at all. When he's not trying to poke you with his whack and stick, he's throwing grenades all over the place that have very large explosion radiuses, so you really need to keep on your toes in this fight and watch out for the grenades are actually going to land, because they will roll for a second after they hit the ground. This is a good fight for using the Lariat in with Hagar, as it allows you to have a pretty good amount of invincibility frames and also potentially hitting him while he's dashing around. But if you're not careful, this guy can really easily screw you up. He's also probably the Final Fight character I've seen the most that's not named Hagar over the years due to his presence as a Street Fighter and Final Fight rep in Mega Man Cross Street Fighter, a game I really need to tackle at some point. The industrial area is rough. There's a lot of things they can do a lot of damage to you very quickly, and if you're not being mobbed by the enemies, you're being mobbed by enemies fall between a literal rock and a hard place in some cases. And now it's time for the second bonus game, Break Glass. Doing the jumping kicks with people like Hagar is the best way to do this, though some pieces of glass take more hits than others. Frankly, these aren't too important to fail. I've had playthroughs where I play this game and I just kind of idle during the bonus games because it gives me a chance to like check my phone or take a bite of my sandwich or whatever. But with that, we're now on to probably my second least favorite stage in the game, although if it's not clear, I'm just not the biggest fan of the second half of this one. We're on to the Bay Area. Whereas the prior stages have moments where you automatically walk out of the screen and get a locale change within some new tile sets or maybe a music shift and all that. The Bay Area, we're just going along the side of a lake the entire time. This is a straight line with very little divergence. I think there's a musical shift halfway through. But this stage I just find kind of dull, I won't lie, although I do love this music once again. With that, let's get back to the game designers. The next person in the arcade versions credit is credited as Hard. They are Kuchan, who we know as Shinji Kuchino. Their first project was on the Speed Rumbler as Hard, which I'm assuming is hardware design, so probably literally designing the chips and all that. This was their fifth project after the arcade version of Willow and UN Squadron as well. They're in the credits for every re-release this game has gotten, as well as Cheeky Cheeky Boys, a game I don't think I have ever heard of that Capcom seemingly put out back in like the arcade and Amiga days. Next up, we got the people credited for character design object, which I believe means they're the more literal sprite artists. There are 3 people listed: Tissue, Prince, and Satoru Yamashita under the pseudonym SY. Tissue and Prince we don't know the identities of at the moment. Tissue seemingly is only credited in this, and Strider Hiryu. Meanwhile, there are several people listed as Prince on our gaming history, but in terms of the Capcom releases, this is the only one they're under, so it might just be their only game if it's the same person. But potentially, they also could have worked on things like Strider for the Atari ST, which, given the connection with Tissue there, that could make sense. Meanwhile, Satoru Yamashita, this was their first project. They also later would work on the console releases. They worked on Magic Sword and Mercs for the arcade releases. Eco Fighters, X-Men Children of the Atom, still an object designer as S. Yamashita. Mega Man 2 Power Fighters, character design, so sprite artist for that. X-Men vs. Street Fighter, Final Fight 1. Just a major fighting game adjacent sprite artist for Capcom, seemingly. Next up, we got character design Scroll, which I believe means they worked on the backgrounds. There are 4 people listed in this. Their pseudonyms are Ponji1 Mikimon, Oka-chan, Ponji2 Fukamari, and Ponji3 Nisui, who in reality, respectively, are Miki Kido, M. Okazaki, Yoko Fukumoto, and Asai Nishisuji. Also, I think it's technically happened a couple of times here and again, but just to shout it out. Obviously, we've seen barrels that we can destroy to get items in the game. There are times they will just have them roll in from off-screen, and they can do some pretty big damage to you. Listen out for the very, like, hollow-sounding tin thud for when that's going to happen. But also watch out if enemies can walk up towards barrels, because they can kick them towards you to do that. Usually, though, I've noticed those barrels can have some pretty good items in them, either some good healing items or a weapon. So it might be good to If you see one coming off on the corner of the screen, maybe start doing some jump attacks to get one as soon as you can. Alright though, back to the background designers. Miki Kido, her first project was Sidearms Hyperdyne in the arcade as a scroll designer, so background artist. And they continue to do that through things like Forgotten Worlds, Gunsmoke, 1943 Kai, until they hit this in '89. They later worked on the Super Nintendo version, King of Dragons as a game master, Bomberman card on the PS2 is special thanks, which is a jump, by the way, from 92 to 2001, which that might seem a bit weird, but they kept up after that. They worked on the FMA and the Broken Angel game on the PS2 for 2D art, its sequel for a map designer. They were later a designer on a lot of the early Mario and Sonic at the Olympic Games games, starting with the Beijing one into the 2009 Winter Olympics game. Their most recent projects are Final Fantasy Explorers on the 3DS as a visual designer for characters, and worked on some of the Naruto Shippuden games on the PSP and 360. M. Okazaki's first project was as a character designer in the arcade version of Willow. Final Fight here in the arcade was their second project. Afterwards, in the 90s at least, they largely kept working on Street Fighter 2 for character design things and doing sprite work. Their most recent project is Criminal Girls 2 Party Favors for the Vita as a map of backgrounds graphics. I have never heard of that game in my life. Though looking at it, yeah, that's an Ipponichi Software game, isn't it? Yoko Fukumoto started in the game scene with Black Tiger in the arcades as a character designer. They then worked on Forgotten Worlds, UN Squadron, until they eventually reached this as a character designer. After this, they worked on Magic Sword and Knights of the Round for scroll design, so background artists there as well. The Dungeons & Dragon Tower Doom arcade game, they were an artist for. Alien vs. Predator in the arcade, they were an artist for. X-Men Triple Reality, background artist. After that, once you hit the mid-90s, a lot more fighting game stuff again. Street Fighter Alpha 2 as a scroll designer. Street Fighter 3 scroll design, so did the backgrounds for that. And they continued to do that all the way up until the turn of the millennium, where they continued to do that for things like Mobile Suit Gundam Federation versus Xeon. And then they did things like stage CG artworks as Fukumoyan in Devil May Cry 2, a game I did not think I'd be bringing up today. Their most recent credits, outside of re-releases of things like Street Fighter 3 and Final Fight, are in Clash of the Titans, the video game for the 360 in the special thanks section, as well as Folklore for the PS3 as a landscape designer. That game is weird. I remember seeing that trailer when I was young and thinking it looked so cool. Asai Nishisuji, on the other hand, this was actually their first project in the arcade release, and they then, like a lot of the other people, worked on things like Street Fighter 2 as a character designer, Super Puzzle Fighter 2 Turbo as a background artist, Street Fighter Alpha 3 background art. But then they started working on backgrounds for games that are a little bit different than the other people we've mentioned thus far, like the handheld Zelda games. They were Asai N as the background artists for Oracle of Seasons and Ages, as well as the Game Boy Advance version of A Link to the Past. Same with Minish Cap, which those backgrounds are gorgeous. They also did backgrounds for the Battle Network and Star Force games, starting in Battle Network 6, moving forward all the way through to the end of that series. They did some background art for Layton vs. Phoenix Wright, Resident Evil 6, they did some environment art, and they're still credited in games more recently like Monster Hunter World as a development manager, Street Fighter 6 as an environment artist, so they're still doing a lot for Capcom. Afterwards, we reached the game's composers, and the unfortunate thing is there are a lot of people who actually did compose for this game, but only one person was ultimately credited, and if you're a Mega Man fan, it's a name that'll sound familiar, Yoshihiro Sakaguchi, who is Yuki-chan's papa. The full list is Harumi Fujita, Yasuaki Fujita, Manami Matsume, which is a name a lot of people should recognize, Yoshihiro Sakaguchi, Yoko Shimamura, Hiromitsu Takaoka, and Junko Tamiya. Going through in order, Harumi Fujita's first credit is doing the music for the NES version of Ghosts and Goblins, as well as the composing for the arcade version of Bionic Commando. They also did composing for Strider on the NES, Willow on the NES, which is a really neat game. The arcade version of this, they were in the special thanks as Mrs. Terumi for Mega Man 3. Bionic Commando on the Game Boy music composer, Final Fight, again, composer, Skyblazer music, Metal Slug, Super Vehicle 001 sound assist, so probably still music stuff. But their more recent credits are things like Contra, Operation Galuga, which came out earlier this year as a retro remix composer. Streets of Rage 4, they did some music for the Brave Wave production side of things there. Windjammers 2, they were a composer. So they're still doing stuff in the music scene to this day. Meanwhile, Yasuaki Fujita, this is also their first project, but they became a composer for Mega Man 3, 4, and Breath of Fire after this. Same with the Metal Slug Super Vehicle 001, so they left to probably work with SNK more than likely because they're also credited for King of Fighters 96. But their most recent credits are I Want to Be the Boshi, which isn't exactly a real credit, and Mega Man 10 doing some composing for, so they stuck with Mega Man for a good while there. before we get into the people that are names people recognize largely, let's talk about Abigail really quick. They can be a bit of a rough fight because he's effectively a boss variant of the Andres we've seen up to this point, only they charge even faster, even though they have a little bit more of a wind-up for it, which you can predict and then do a jump kick to try and interrupt. But they'll also just punch you outright from pretty good distances and can do a lot of damage. Play this fight safe and go at a distance for the most part, and if you can grapple another enemy, do a pile drive with Hagar if you're playing as them to do some extra damage. I'd ultimately say Abigail's probably harder more for the grunts that spawn in during the fight than he himself, though, as he can bring in some tankier enemies like the larger enemies and all that, so be careful. So getting back to the composers, the next one up is Minami Matsume, who is probably one of the most famous composers at Capcom, given that she's the one that composed Mega Man 1 and Mega Man 2, let alone UN Squadron, Dynasty Warriors, Magic Sword, Batman Return of the Joker, which that game has a lot of weird stuff in it, but the music's good, as well as a very personal one to me, Adventures of Lolo on Game Boy, music composer. She went freelance at some point, but she never truly escaped Mega Man, doing music for Mega Man 10, Mighty No. 9, Mighty Gunvolt Burst, and all that. Her most recent projects are Everhood Eternity Edition on the PS4, and The Good Life as a heartwarming message performer. Yoshihiro Sakaguchi is the one known as Yuki-chan's Papa, which is a nickname people might recognize from games like Commando on the NES, Mega Man on the NES, Street Fighter in the arcades. Did extra composing for Mega Man 2, but they continued into the UN Squadron, Final Fight, Street Fighter Minds for a little bit, doing the composition for things like Breath of Fire and Warriors of Fate along the time as well. Their most recent credit is in the sound design for I Am Setsuna. Moving on the list, if you don't recognize who Yoko Shimomura is by name at this point, you're not playing enough RPGs is all I'm gonna say, because holy shit, she has done so much since the Super Nintendo that it's kind of nuts. She's up there with Uematsu as an all-timer. Hiromitsu Takaoka, this was their first credit. They were also in Cheeky Cheeky Boys, Super Buster Bros, but largely they haven't done anything outside of those since 1994, outside of re-releases. Meanwhile, Junko Tamiya, just to wrap up the composers, their first project was Gunsmoke on the NES, Bionic Commando they did the music for on the NES. Little Nemo the Dream Master, they composed the music for that. Same with Street Fighter 2010, The Final Fight, a game I need to tackle at some point. Final Fight here was actually one of their later projects, and largely their most recent credit was in the re-release of Street Fighter 3 on the PS3. But with that, I'm going to need to end this off here. Thank you guys for watching, and in part 3, we're going to go tackle the final stage, and trust me, it's a rough one. See you guys then.